The morning is not fully warm yet, and already the ground is being rewritten. German armored spearheads drive forward in tight, disciplined columns, their tracks grinding frost and dirt into a single grey paste. Before noon, the first Soviet defensive line is punctured, cleanly, almost professionally. Minefields are breached, forward bunkers are overrun. The corridor opens with a speed that feels less like combat and more like momentum. On the radios, the tone is clipped and certain. Line breached, objective reached, resistance light. These are not just reports, they are confirmations that the plan is unfolding exactly as it was imagined on paper. Each transmission stacks onto the next, building a single message for everyone listening. The breakthrough is real, and it is working. At headquarters, maps are spread across tables and hoods of vehicles. Grease pencils draw long arrows eastward, extending beyond the morning's targets, as if geography itself is now negotiable. Staff officers begin speaking in past tense without noticing. Not "we are breaking through," but "we have broken through." The breach is treated as a finished fact, not a fragile condition. And then comes the most reassuring sight of all. The enemy appears to be falling back. Positions ahead are found half abandoned. Gun pits are quiet. Small Soviet elements are seen pulling away rather than standing and dying. To German eyes, trained by earlier victories, withdrawal has a familiar meaning. Pressure is working. The enemy is cracking. The path forward is opening. But on a battlefield, the most dangerous thing is not always fire. Sometimes it is silence. Sometimes it is empty space that looks like weakness and is actually design. Somewhere between the confident radio traffic and the neat arrows on the map, a small assumption slips into the operation, unspoken, unverified, and therefore powerful. If the Soviets are retreating, their reserves must already be spent. No one challenges it, because when success arrives early, the hardest thing to do is pause and ask why. And in that pause that never happens, the breakthrough begins to lean, quietly, toward something else. Speed becomes its own kind of evidence. As German columns push deeper into the breach, commanders begin to feel they are operating ahead of the enemy's ability to react. Roads are taken faster than expected. Villages fall without prolonged fighting. The tempo itself creates a sense of control, as if movement has already solved problems that have not yet been seen. The resistance they do encounter feels uneven, bursts of fire, brief engagements, then silence again. To experienced German officers, this looks familiar. Disorganization often precedes collapse. A retreating enemy rarely coordinates well, and every kilometer gained without a fight reinforces the belief that the Red Army is losing cohesion. What feels like encouragement is mistaken for confirmation. Forward units begin to stretch. Tank commanders press on to maintain pressure, unwilling to give the enemy time to recover. Orders emphasize momentum, not consolidation. The doctrine rewards boldness, and boldness now appears to be paying dividends. Caution, by comparison, feels almost irresponsible. Behind them, the machinery meant to verify reality struggles to keep pace. Reconnaissance reports arrive late, describing terrain and contacts the spearheads have already passed. Information becomes retrospective rather than predictive. Decisions are made on yesterday's picture, not today's ground. But the advance continues anyway, because nothing immediately contradicts it. Attention narrows. The road ahead dominates planning discussions, while the flanks become abstract lines on a map. Security elements are assumed to be sufficient because they have not yet failed. The absence of trouble is interpreted as proof that no trouble exists. It is an easy conclusion to accept when everything else appears to be working. Even those who sense fragility see it as temporary. The breakthrough feels thin, yes, but also full of promise. A little more speed, a little more pressure, and the opening might widen into something decisive. That hope becomes the quiet justification. At the heart of the advance sits a belief that is never formally stated, yet quietly shapes every order that follows. German command begins to operate as if Soviet reserves have already been spent. The idea does not arrive as intelligence. It arrives as atmosphere, an expectation formed by speed, early success, and familiar patterns from earlier campaigns. No document confirms it. No aerial photograph proves it. The belief is inherited, passed from one headquarters to another without friction. The Red Army has retreated under pressure before, sometimes suddenly, sometimes chaotically. Memory fills the gaps where verification should live. History becomes a substitute for observation. What few consider is that withdrawal can be a choice. Soviet units are not fleeing blindly, they are pulling back in sequence. Ground is given up selectively. Positions that no longer serve a purpose are abandoned without a fight. But from inside the narrow corridor of advance, intent is invisible. Only movement is seen, and movement away is translated as weakness. The empty space ahead is therefore treated as invitation. The gap in front of the spearheads is read as opportunity rather than warning. Each kilometer gained seems to confirm the assumption that there is nothing substantial left to meet them. The logic becomes circular. The faster they advance, the more correct the belief appears. There are moments when the operation could pause. A short halt would allow reconnaissance to catch up. Flank strength could be assessed. Soviet force density ahead could be measured rather than guessed. The maps could be allowed to reflect reality instead of optimism. None of this would violate doctrine. None of it would end the offensive. But the pause is rejected. Delay is feared more than uncertainty. Stopping now feels like surrendering initiative, and initiative has become the operation's most prized possession. Speed is no longer just a method, it is the justification. And so the assumption hardens into decision. The belief that Soviet reserves are exhausted becomes the lens through which every new report is interpreted. Warnings are For Erich von Manstein, hesitation has never been a virtue. His reputation, earned in earlier campaigns, rests on a simple conviction: breakthroughs exist to be exploited, not examined. Once the enemy line bends, it must be pushed until it breaks completely. History, in his view, does not reward those who stop to take measurements in the middle of success. His confidence is not born of impulse, but of experience. Again and again, speed and nerve have delivered results where caution would have allowed the enemy to recover. Manstein has seen what happens when momentum is surrendered. He has watched opportunities harden into stalemates simply because commanders waited for perfect information. To him, delay is not neutral, it is an advantage handed to the enemy. From this perspective, the current situation feels familiar. A breach has been achieved, the enemy is withdrawing, the front appears fluid, everything about the moment argues for pressure. To slow down now would mean abandoning the very principle that made the breakthrough possible in the first place. The decision to press forward is not reckless. It is consistent with doctrine, with past success, and with Manstein's understanding of operational warfare. Reconnaissance units are instructed to keep pace with the advance, even as distances stretch. Their task is no longer to shape decisions, but to confirm movement already underway. Armor formations receive orders to widen the penetration, expanding the corridor before the enemy can seal it. The emphasis is on space and depth, on turning a narrow opening into something irreversible. From the command level, the battlefield still appears manageable. Maps suggest flexibility, reports emphasize progress. The risks are acknowledged, but treated as manageable variables rather than existential threats. The assumption that Soviet reserves are exhausted makes every aggressive move feel justified. What lies ahead? As the orders move down the chain, the tempo increases. Columns tighten, engines run longer, schedules compress. The operation begins to accelerate under its own weight, driven less by fresh assessment than by the logic of continuation. Stopping now would require admitting uncertainty. Moving forward requires only belief. What Manstein cannot see, what no commander inside the breakthrough can fully grasp, is how the battlefield looks from the outside, how the widening penetration also lengthens exposure, how speed reshapes not only opportunity but vulnerability. For the moment, however, the logic holds. Pressure promises resolution, momentum feels like mastery, and with every order to advance, the operation commits itself more deeply to a path. Beyond the narrow corridor of the breakthrough, the battlefield looks very different. Soviet withdrawals are not chaotic or improvised. They unfold in measured stages, governed by preplanned lines and disciplined timing. Units disengage when their purpose is fulfilled, not when they are overwhelmed. What appears to the Germans as collapse is, in fact, controlled subtraction. Behind the abandoned forward positions, the Red Army's second and third defensive lines remain intact. Trenches are occupied, camouflage is maintained, communications hold. These positions were never meant to stop the initial blow, they exist to absorb what comes next. The space between them is not emptiness, it is depth, deliberately preserved. Anti-tank guns tell the same story. They are not destroyed or left behind in panic. Crews withdraw them carefully, shifting fields of fire to new angles, often unseen from the German axis of advance. Each movement trades ground for geometry, positioning steel to meet armor where it will be most vulnerable. Nothing about it is hurried. Artillery waits even more patiently. Soviet gunners do not fire at the first sight of armor. They wait for density rather than contact, for moments when German vehicles cluster, when supply columns compress, when speed forces order to tighten. Their silence is not absence, it is restraint. Behind the front, mobile reserves are already in motion. Tank brigades and mechanized infantry maneuver along routes hidden from aerial observation, using forests, folds in the terrain, and rail spurs to reposition without announcing themselves. They are not reacting to the breakthrough, they are shaping its future. What the Germans interpret as a widening opportunity is, from another angle, a narrowing corridor. The battlefield is being sculpted to draw strength inward, to lengthen flanks while shortening escape. The apparent collapse functions as a funnel, broad at the entrance, constricted at its core. Inside the spearhead, none of this is visible. The Germans see only what lies directly ahead, open ground, fading resistance, distance gained. They do not see the angles forming on their sides or the mass accumulating just beyond their perception. Their maps grow bolder even as their position grows more delicate. The danger is not sudden, it is structural. Every kilometer advance deepens commitment while reducing flexibility. Every order to widen the penetration increases exposure. The operation feels alive, dynamic, successful, yet its shape is being decided elsewhere, by forces waiting for the moment when movement becomes predictability. And so the German columns continue forward, engines steady, formations extended, advancing deeper into the narrowest part of a design they do not know exists, one that will soon begin to close, not from the front, but from the sides. As the spearheads drive deeper, the simple geometry of the advance begins to change. Lead units move faster than everything meant to protect them. Tanks and half-tracks surge forward along the best roads, while the rest of the formation, infantry, engineers, artillery, maintenance, falls behind in uneven waves. What began as a coordinated thrust becomes a stretched ribbon of steel and fuel. Infantry, in particular, struggles to keep pace. Much of it moves on foot, burdened with weapons, ammunition, and winter kit, forced to fight the terrain as much as the enemy. Even motorized elements cannot match the tempo of the armored vanguard for long. The gap between those who seize ground and those who hold it widens quietly, kilometer by kilometer. Behind the front line of vehicles, supply columns begin to extend. Fuel trucks, ammunition lorries, field kitchens, recovery vehicles, everything that makes an armored advance possible, threads itself through narrow roads and damaged bridges. The column stretches, then compresses, then stretches again as traffic snarls around craters, wrecks, and improvised detours. A breakthrough is not powered by courage, it is powered by logistics, and logistics does not like speed. Flank security, meanwhile, becomes something discussed more than executed. On paper, units are assigned to guard the sides of the penetration, to screen villages, crossroads, and tree lines. In practice, those units are often too few, too tired, or too far behind to do more than patrol symbols on a map. The flanks exist in orders and staff briefings, but on the ground, they begin to thin into assumption. Yet the maps still look good. Arrows continue to point east. Objectives are checked off. Reports emphasize distance gained and enemy withdrawal. Headquarters sees progress measured in kilometers and timetables, and that progress feels solid because it can be drawn. But reality is now changing faster than reporting can capture. Small warnings begin to appear, an outpost that fires from an unexpected direction, a convoy that reports movement in the woods, a delayed unit that cannot explain why the road behind it suddenly feels unsafe. These incidents are filed as local friction, the inevitable noise of war. Nothing, yet, seems large enough to challenge the broader narrative of success. But the divergence has begun. The picture in headquarters is becoming cleaner as the battlefield becomes messier. The operation's confidence remains intact while its structure quietly weakens. The spearheads are still moving, but they are moving away from the very things that make movement survivable. This is how a small mistake matures, not through a single catastrophic decision, but through accumulation, through distance, through tempo, through the slow transformation of flanks from physical protection into theoretical comfort. The first reports are brief and strangely worded. German units begin to describe fire coming from directions that do not fit the map, not ahead, not directly behind, but from the sides, tree lines, shallow ridges, villages that were assumed to be cleared hours earlier. At first, these contacts are treated as isolated pockets, remnants missed in the rush forward. Then the pattern sharpens. Soviet anti-tank guns open fire from prepared angles, striking armor where it is least protected. Shots arrive low and flat, coordinated rather than random. Crews realize too late that these guns were not chasing the advance, they were waiting for it. The battlefield, which had felt open and permissive, suddenly develops edges. German tanks halt to return fire, turrets traverse, engines idle as gunners search for muzzle flashes that vanish after each shot. Every pause feels temporary, but each one costs time. The smooth rhythm of the advance breaks into short, violent stops. What was once a flowing movement becomes a series of sharp interruptions. Momentum begins to bleed away minute by minute. Vehicles bunch together as they slow, creating the density Soviet artillery has been waiting for. Roads clog with armor forced to maneuver under fire. Supply vehicles hesitate, unsure whether to push forward or pull back. The corridor narrows not on the map, but in practice. Communications suffer immediately. Radio nets fill with overlapping reports, requests, warnings, fragments of information without context. Some units describe heavy fire, others report none at all. Command struggles to distinguish local friction from systemic threat. The clearer the battlefield becomes to those under fire, the less coherent it appears from above. Requests for flank support multiply. Platoons ask for infantry cover that is no longer nearby. Company commanders request artillery strikes against positions they cannot clearly identify. Reconnaissance units are pushed forward hastily, often into the breakthrough once defined by speed, now defines itself by hesitation. Tanks that were meant to surge forward are forced to turn sideways, exposing their profiles as they fight threats they were never meant to face alone. The psychological shift is subtle but profound. The advance is no longer about exploiting weakness. It is about surviving contact. What makes the situation dangerous is not any single engagement, but accumulation. Each halt invites another. Each delay widens the window for Soviet coordination. Fire from the sides is no longer surprising, it is expected. And expectation replaces confidence. The corridor that once felt elastic now feels tight. The Germans are still moving, still fighting, still advancing in places, but the sense of inevitability is gone. The operation has entered a new phase, one not defined by momentum, but by resistance that arrives from angles the original plan never fully accounted for. The breakthrough has not failed, not yet, but it is no longer clean, and as pressure builds along its thinning edges, the question is no longer how far it can go, but how long it can remain open at all. German doctrine has always favored depth. The logic is elegant: penetrate fast, move far, and force the enemy to react to threats in his rear before he can stabilize the front. In earlier campaigns, depth had brought decision. It had unbalanced opponents who could not reposition quickly enough, but depth, like all advantages, carries a price when conditions change. Now the very distance gained begins to work against the advance. The deeper the spearheads push, the longer and more fragile their lifelines become. Roads that once served as arteries turn into vulnerabilities. Every kilometer forward multiplies the effort required to sustain momentum, and the battlefield begins to stretch beyond the reach of centralized control. Soviet artillery recognizes this shift almost immediately. Rather than contest the armored spearheads head-on, batteries begin to target the spaces behind them. Supply routes come under intermittent fire, bridges, crossroads, narrow forest roads where trucks must slow and bunch together. The shells are not fired in desperation. They are placed with intent, aimed at movement rather than position. Fuel shortages appear where none were expected. Tank crews report running low sooner than calculations predicted. Trucks are delayed, rerouted, or destroyed. What should have been routine resupply becomes uncertain, then unreliable. An armored formation can fight briefly without fuel. It cannot maneuver without it, and without maneuver, speed loses meaning. Air support struggles to compensate. The front has expanded unevenly, creating a patchwork of engagement zones that are difficult to prioritize. Aircraft can strike targets of opportunity, but they cannot be everywhere at once. Requests for close air support stack up faster than they can be answered. The sky, once an ally, becomes another limited resource. As pressure increases, control begins to fragment. Local commanders are forced to improvise solutions to problems that no longer fit the original plan. Units reroute themselves. Supply officers make independent decisions about priorities. Tanks are repositioned not to advance, but to shield convoys or hold critical intersections. Each decision makes sense in isolation. Collectively, they pull the operation apart. Central Command still issues orders, but those orders arrive late or address conditions that have already changed. The gap between instruction and execution widens. The offensive no longer moves as a single instrument. It becomes a collection of local efforts, each reacting to immediate threats, each sacrificing coherence for survival. This is the hidden cost of speed. What once unified the advance now exposes it. Depth, achieved too quickly and held too loosely, turns into vulnerability. The Germans are not being defeated by a single blow. They are being strained by distance, by friction, by the slow erosion of synchronization. The battlefield no longer rewards bold extension. It rewards coordination, mass, and timing, qualities that require pause and preparation. The offensive still exists on paper. Units are still fighting, still holding ground, still moving in places, but the clarity that once defined the breakthrough has dissolved. What remains is effort without unity, movement without direction, an advance that continues because stopping feels dangerous, even as continuing becomes unsustainable. And as improvisation replaces, the moment arrives without announcement. There is no single signal, no dramatic reversal on the map. Instead, pressure begins to build along the flanks with a coordination that feels different from everything that came before. Soviet reserves, until now unseen, move into contact not as scattered responses, but as deliberate counterstrokes aimed at the weakest points of the penetration. These forces do not strike the spearheads head-on. They strike the sides. Mechanized units push against overstretched security elements. Infantry supported by armor appears where the Germans expected only empty ground. What had been treated as secondary space suddenly becomes decisive terrain. The Germans begin to understand that the enemy has not been reacting to the breakthrough, they have been waiting for it to overextend. The threat of isolation becomes real. The corridor that once felt wide enough to maneuver now narrows under pressure from both sides. Roads that carried fuel and ammunition are cut intermittently, then contested. Units at the front receive orders that assume access they no longer reliably have. The distance between advance elements and their support grows more dangerous by the hour. Inside the spearheads, the change is immediate and unsettling. Tanks that were built to move forward aggressively are forced to pivot sideways, their guns trained not toward distant objectives, but toward threats creeping in from forests, villages, and folds in the ground. Orientation shifts from advance to defense. Direction loses clarity. Casualties begin to rise, not in dramatic spikes, but steadily. Vehicles are damaged or immobilized in places that offer no strategic gain. Crews fight hard for ground that does not matter, simply to keep corridors open a little longer. Each engagement consumes strength without producing progress. The arithmetic of the offensive turns unfavorable. At higher levels, language begins to change. Orders that once emphasized expansion now focus on stabilization. The word containment enters discussions, at first cautiously, then with growing frequency. It is a subtle admission that the breakthrough is no longer being shaped, it is being managed. The objective is no longer to exploit success, but to prevent disaster. The initiative, once firmly in German hands, starts to waver. Soviet actions dictate tempo. Counterattacks arrive when German units are low on fuel or ammunition. Pressure increases where coordination is weakest. The Red Army does not rush, it squeezes. Each movement tightens the operational space available to the advance. What makes the moment decisive is not that the Germans are suddenly outmatched everywhere. It is that their freedom of choice begins to shrink. Every decision now carries defensive weight. Every kilometer forward risks cutting another thread behind them. The breakthrough, once an instrument of control, becomes a liability that demands constant protection. The trap is not revealed all at once. It becomes visible only as options disappear. The corridor narrows, the flanks harden, the cost of movement rises while its value declines. What was meant to open the battlefield has begun to close it. And as German commanders search for ways to restore momentum, they confront a realization that will define everything that follows. Pressure along the penetration increases steadily, then relentlessly. Soviet forces no longer probe the flanks, they press them with intent. Each engagement tightens the operational space, turning what was once a corridor of movement into a contested zone of friction. The Germans are no longer deciding where to fight. They are responding to where the fighting arrives. Supply routes become the immediate concern. Fuel, ammunition, food, medical evacuation, everything that sustained the advance now depends on roads under fire. German units fight not for objectives on the map, but for intersections, bridges, and stretches of road that must remain open for one more hour, then one more. The logic of the operation contracts around survival. For the first time, armor is used primarily in a defensive role. Tanks dig in along approaches they were never meant to hold, their guns covering roads instead of leading columns forward. Crews fight from static positions, conserving fuel, waiting for targets rather than chasing them. The psychological shift is unmistakable. These machines were designed for motion. Now they exist to delay. Command language changes accordingly. Orders that once emphasized tempo and depth now focus on preservation and coordination. The question is no longer how to exploit weakness, but how to avoid collapse. Units are told to hold, to screen, to buy time. The battlefield, not doctrine, dictates decisions. This loss of initiative is not dramatic, but it is absolute. Soviet pressure arrives when German formations are least prepared to absorb it, during resupply, during repositioning, during attempts to consolidate fragile gains. Every movement is contested. Every pause carries risk. The Germans are still capable, still disciplined, still dangerous, but they are no longer shaping events. As hours pass, the reality becomes unavoidable. The breakthrough cannot be held without unacceptable cost. Reinforcing it would require resources better spent elsewhere. Holding ground no longer promises advantage, it only delays consequence. Retreat, once unthinkable, now appears as the only rational path left. The inevitability is felt long before it is officially acknowledged. Field commanders begin adjusting positions instinctively, shortening lines where possible, preparing fallback routes without waiting for formal approval. These are not acts of panic, they are acts of recognition. When the order finally comes, it confirms what the battlefield has already decided. The objective is no longer expansion, it is extraction. The breakthrough, so carefully created, so confidently extended, is to be abandoned before it consumes what remains of the force committed to it. The end does not arrive with collapse or chaos. It arrives quietly, through controlled movements under pressure, through disciplined withdrawals that accept loss in exchange for survival. The Germans do not flee, they disengage, and in doing so, they concede the central truth of the operation. The breakthrough has ended. Not because the enemy was suddenly invincible, not because German forces lacked courage or skill, but because the assumptions that carried the advance forward can no longer sustain it. Speed has turned into exposure, depth has turned into strain, initiative has turned into liability. What began as an operation designed to unbalance the enemy has instead unbalanced itself. The battlefield has imposed its verdict, indifferent to intent or reputation. And as German units pull back from ground that cost them time, fuel, and lives to reach, one fact settles in with quiet. The withdrawal begins without spectacle. Orders move quietly through units already under strain, instructing them not to hold, but to move, methodically, deliberately, and under constant observation. This is not a retreat born of panic. It is a controlled extraction executed by forces trained to leave a battlefield without letting it unravel behind them. Losses come steadily, not catastrophically. Vehicles are hit during movement. Convoys are disrupted. Small rearguard actions flare and vanish along contested roads. But there is no sudden collapse, no encirclement snapping shut. Discipline holds. Units disengage in sequence, covering one another as they fall back from positions that no longer justify their cost. Equipment is abandoned when necessary. Disabled tanks are blown in place to prevent capture. Trucks with empty fuel tanks are left behind so crews can move on foot or crowd into remaining vehicles. These decisions are not sentimental. Steel can be replaced. Trained men cannot. The arithmetic of survival governs every choice. The Red Army, for its part, does not pursue recklessly. Soviet commanders understand what they have achieved and what they do not need to risk. Pressure is applied where it matters, along key routes, against exposed rearguards, but there is no headlong chase into prepared German defenses. The objective is not annihilation, it is control. As German forces pull back, the front begins to thicken again, lines shorten, units regain contact with neighboring formations, supply routes stabilize as distances compress. The battlefield, which had been stretched and strained, slowly regains shape. The chaos of the penetration gives way to something more familiar and more static. The ground that cost so much to gain is surrendered in stages. Villages taken days earlier are abandoned without ceremony. Roads that once symbolized progress now serve only as exits. There is no debate about holding symbolic points. What matters is coherence, not pride. For the men involved, the shift is unmistakable. The sense of driving history forward has faded. In its place is the quieter task of getting out intact. Crews watch the same terrain pass beneath them in reverse, knowing how briefly they held it and how much effort it demanded. By the time the withdrawal completes, the moment has already passed. The opportunity that once seemed to exist no longer does. The battlefield has moved on. What remains is a stabilized front and an operation recorded not for what it achieved, but for what it revealed. The Germans have not been destroyed. They have not been routed, but they have been corrected by terrain, by enemy restraint, and by the consequences of a decision made earlier when speed felt like certainty. The breakthrough is now a matter of record, not momentum. It existed, it moved, and then it was undone, not by a single blow, but by the steady pressure of reality reasserting itself. As guns fall silent along the newly formed line, there is no sense of resolution, only recognition. The ground gained is gone, the losses remain, and the war, indifferent to intention, continues on terms shaped by those who waited rather than rushed. The moment is over, and what follows will be measured not in distance advanced, but in what that brief advance ultimately cost. The cost of the retreat is not measured only in ground surrendered. It is measured in what cannot be recovered. Tanks are lost not because they were overwhelmed in battle, but because they ran out of fuel at the wrong moment or broke down too far forward to be repaired. Vehicles that had survived combat are destroyed by their own crews, abandoned to prevent capture. These are losses born not of defeat, but of overextension. Fuel, always scarce, is burned without return. What was poured into pushing the breakthrough forward cannot be reclaimed on the way back. Every kilometer advanced and then abandoned represents consumption without gain. In a war where logistics decide tempo, this imbalance matters long after the guns fall quiet. More damaging still is the thinning of experienced crews. Veteran tank commanders and mechanics, the men who knew how to coax performance from overstressed machines, are lost in small numbers, steadily, during disengagements and rearguard actions. There is no single disastrous moment, no obvious breaking point, just attrition, and attrition of experience cannot be replaced quickly. Across the front, the effects ripple outward. Operational tempo slows as formations pause to rebuild strength, reassign equipment, and integrate replacements. Plans that once assumed flexibility are rewritten with caution. The willingness to attempt bold penetrations diminishes, not because doctrine has changed, but because margin has been consumed. On the other side, the Red Army absorbs the lesson differently. Soviet confidence increases, not from triumph, but from confirmation. They have seen that German breakthroughs can be shaped, strained, and reversed, that speed can be answered with patience, that assumptions can be punished. This knowledge strengthens future defenses more than any captured ground. German freedom of maneuver shrinks accordingly. Each operation now carries the weight of what was lost. Reserves are fewer, fuel stocks are tighter, experienced crews are spread thinner. Where once commanders could choose between aggression and caution, now the choice is narrow. The battlefield becomes more rigid, less forgiving. The war itself grows more constrained. Fronts stabilize more quickly, opportunities close faster. The space for improvisation contracts as both sides learn. What had once felt fluid hardens into structure, and structure favors the side willing to wait. The irony is quiet but profound. The original mistake was small, an assumption made plausible by success, but its consequences extend far beyond the operation that revealed it. Each future plan must now account for what was spent unnecessarily. Each future risk is weighed against losses that did not need to happen. Breakthroughs magnify everything they touch. They amplify success, but they also amplify error. In fast-moving operations, small misjudgments do not remain small for long. They are carried forward by momentum, reinforced by repetition, and protected by early success. What might have been corrected in a slower battle becomes embedded in motion. Speed reduces the time available for doubt. Decisions must be made before information fully arrives, and when early outcomes appear favorable, uncertainty feels unnecessary. The faster an army moves, the harder it becomes to question the assumptions that enabled that movement. Correction requires pause, and pause feels dangerous when momentum is treated as survival. Assumptions once accepted begin to harden. They stop being hypotheses and start behaving like facts. Orders are written around them. Movements depend on them. Reports are interpreted through them. Over time, the battlefield itself seems to confirm them, not because they are correct, but because actions shaped by belief produce predictable appearances. War becomes a mirror that reflects expectation. Momentum without awareness is rarely neutral. It rewards those moments when reality aligns with belief and punishes the moments when it does not. In this case, speed carried German forces deep into space they did not fully understand, at a tempo that outpaced verification. Intelligence was not absent, but it arrived too slowly to influence decisions already made. This is one of war's quiet paradoxes. Information loses value when movement outruns thought. Reconnaissance that arrives after commitment becomes commentary rather than guidance. Warnings that challenge momentum feel like obstacles instead of safeguards. In fast wars, knowledge must compete with confidence, and confidence often wins. The smallest misjudgment travels farthest. A single assumption that Soviet reserves were exhausted shaped planning, tempo, flank security, logistics, and risk tolerance. It influenced how silence was interpreted, in the official records, the operation is eventually summarized with clinical language. Objectives were reached, ground was taken, forces withdrew. In the final accounting, it is recorded as a failure, not because nothing happened, but because nothing endured. The breakthrough is acknowledged, then dismissed, folded into the long arithmetic of a war that no longer rewards fleeting advantage. On paper, the breakthrough clearly existed. Maps show arrows extending deep into enemy territory. Timelines record days of movement and kilometers gained. Reports confirm that the first defensive line was shattered and that momentum carried German forces far beyond their initial objectives. By conventional measures, it looks like success. But success in war is not defined by motion alone. In reality, the breakthrough was never secure. From the moment it was created, it depended on assumptions rather than control. Its flanks were thin, its supply lines were fragile, its depth outpaced understanding. What appeared solid on maps existed only so long as the enemy allowed it to. One assumption shaped every decision that followed, that Soviet reserves were exhausted and that withdrawal meant collapse. This belief influenced tempo, posture, and risk tolerance. It encouraged speed over verification, extension over consolidation. Each choice made sense within that framework. Together, they built an operation that could advance, but not endure. The retreat that followed was not inevitable. It was earned. It was the consequence of decisions taken when options were still wide, when pause and reassessment were possible. By the time withdrawal became necessary, the cost of leaving had already been fixed. What might have been a controlled disengagement earlier became a costly extraction later. The opportunity never returned, not because the enemy grew stronger overnight, but because the margin for error had been spent. Fuel was gone, crews were lost, confidence was replaced by caution. The front hardened. The conditions that once made bold movement possible no longer existed. The window closed, quietly but permanently. What remains is not a dramatic story of defeat, but a precise lesson in control. The Germans believed that breaking through meant mastery of the battlefield, that movement equaled dominance, that speed could substitute for certainty, but control is not created by motion. It is created by understanding of terrain, of enemy intent, of one's own limits. In this operation, control was assumed rather than established, and because it was never truly possessed, it could not be held. History does not linger on the excitement of the advance. It remembers the outcome. A breakthrough that promised decision delivered only exposure. An opportunity seized too quickly became a liability that demanded retreat. The battlefield did not punish ambition, it punished untested belief. The final irony is quiet. The Germans did not lose because they failed to move fast enough. They lost because they moved with confidence where control had not yet been earned. The distinction is small in theory and decisive in practice. They thought the breakthrough meant control. But control was the one thing they never truly had. And once that truth asserted itself,